Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Hey, Neats. Great to have you join us from Taiwan. Hey, Andre. Good to see you. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. We are really going to be talking about some interesting things tonight. If you've ever wrestled through leaving church, we're going to get into it and continue with what Andre was saying. Shabbat Shalom. It's really good to be with everyone. Shabbat Shalom. It's so good to see everyone and to be back. Welcome to Sabbath Collective, a community of people interested in celebrating the Sabbath and pursuing God through a Hebraic worldview of the Bible. And again, we're going to be continuing with this series, Losing Church and Finding God. About 2 years ago or so, I had a young man talk to me who was maybe about 35 or so with a wife and a child, and he was telling me his story of leaving church. Randall, great to see you. Shabbat Shalom. And he grew up in church. He went to kids club, he went to youth group, he volunteered, he went to retreats and conferences and all-night prayer services, and his choice to leave the church was one of the most painful decisions he'd had to make in his life. Was he a quitter? Was he unfaithful? Was God angry? Would he go to hell? He didn't take any of it lightly, and in fact, it took him several years to get to the point where he did make a decision. And even after he made the decision to leave the church that he was a part of, he still wrestled with life in this new way. So I want to look at tonight at what are reasons that people may have for leaving their churches. And let me just preface this by saying this is not going to be a religious sociology teaching or even a history teaching. Okay, although I did post a couple things that I had written on the history of the church and the Sabbath Collective members group. If you're part of that, you can download that information and read it. This is also not an instruction to stay or to leave your church. This is more about kind of opening up the conversation about when you're deciding, or if you have decided, to leave the Western church model. What does that process feel like? And know this, as Andre said in his teaching 2 weeks ago, if you're one of those ones who are uncomfortable, even angry, and have left, you're in good company. And there can be some good reasons that people leave their local church. So I want to kind of look at the main ones that I'm hearing. And the first one is exclusivity. Now, let me just say this. Exclusivity is not necessarily a bad word, okay? Randall, Anita, Ashley, Andre, if you're still on, you are all in exclusive relationships, right? So exclusivity is not a bad word. Relationships can be exclusive. My home is exclusively for my family and the people that I invite into it. It just isn't open to the public to come in, whoever wants to, right? So exclusivity is not a bad word, but we're talking about exclusivity in faith communities. This sense that there are people kept on the outside. And this manifests in many different ways. This Western Greek worldview of only one right way and everything else is wrong. This sort of sets up parameters of exclusivity in the practice of the Western church. And oftentimes people who attend churches do not invite friends to come and openly say to their friends, well, there's a lot I disagree with. Listen, let me just preface this. Hey, Danielle, great to see you, honey. Shabbat Shalom. By saying complete agreement in faith communities is definitely not the goal. That'll never happen. But what does the disagreement part look like? There is not necessarily in some churches today, and this is what people are struggling with, an openness to differing opinions, other perspectives. And this Christian exclusivity looks like, for example, the evangelical school I was reading about, Wheaton College, disciplined a tenured political science professor, a woman of color named Larisha Hawkins, after she said she would wear a hijab as an act of Advent devotion in solidarity with Muslims facing harassment after the San Bernardino terrorist shooting. So she was actually suspended from her post. I just did recent research on her. They made a documentary about it. 45 had something to say about it. Everybody was weighing in on this woman. And here's what she said. She said, I'm standing in solidarity with them. And she said, Christians and Muslims worship the same God. Well, what's wrong with that statement? We do, right? We do. Same father. Wheaton College officials felt her words violated the exclusive character of the college's evangelical statement of faith. So what they said was that her words violated the exclusive character of the college's evangelical statement of faith. And what she said was, well, hey, if Muslims are persecuted for praying, Christians are going to be persecuted for praying. No one can pray. Like, we need to stand up against religious persecution. Well, apparently not. There's only one kind of religion that is accepted in this exclusive character, right? And that's more and more what we see. Barika, good to see you. And we will be praying for your daddies in the hospital. Definitely. We'll be praying, Barika. Josh Packard and Ashley Hope published Church Refugees. Sociologists reveal why people are done with church but not their faith. That's their published work. Professor Packard says, we found time and time again that people were leaving not because they couldn't find agreement. In fact, many were leaving because they couldn't find disagreement. And he coined the term the dones. I like that. I'm done. I say that all the time about things. I'm done. Fear fuels this need to be right? This is a very Greek Western way of thinking. To be exclusive, to be isolated, to defend the faith, to not let it get, quote, watered down. Interestingly enough, the Messianic movement, which was the first Jewish people that were following Yeshua as a rabbi and following him as the risen Savior, the Messiah, after his resurrection, this group of people, this Messianic movement, was actually considered a sect of Judaism. So, in other words, they were practicing Jewish people. But what they believed was that the Messiah had come and risen from the dead. And this was okay. They worshiped at the temple. They kept the practices, the festivals, the kosher eating as they had always done. Yet then they included non-kosher people, like me, a Gentile, and they gave them different laws. Now there were some growing pains in that, but it happened. And there were a few religious zealots who were the Jewish people who did not like the Messianic Jewish people or the larger group, but they were actually historically in the minority. For the most part, these different people with different beliefs, and by the way, that's pretty major. That's a pretty major difference, isn't it? If you're an Orthodox Jew, you're waiting for the Messiah, and here's these Jewish people over here who said, no, the Messiah actually was here. His name was Yeshua. I knew him, or I heard of him, and he rose from the dead. That's a pretty major difference. And yet they practiced together their faith, and they coexisted together. Another kind of exclusivity we see in modern Western churches is seen in the elite or the chosen that will be valued by the church leadership. And those chosen that are chosen to come into the inner fold can be because of their money. Maybe they're big earners. Maybe they're big tithers. It could be because of their talent. Oh man, this woman can really paint or really sing, or this guy can really play the drums, or maybe what demographic they're part of. Oh man, we need to target people of color or millennials with beards or single women and that they fit this demographic, right? And so they're targeted. If you're not part of the target demographic, however, you may not feel like you fit in at all. And perhaps you can't even meet any of the leadership. I was just talking to Ian, who's in our community. Hey, Shabbat Shalom, Diana, good to see you. I'm sure he wouldn't mind me saying this at all. He had a really difficult time at a church he was attending where he was volunteering in the kids program, and he was an awesome volunteer in the kids program. He couldn't even meet people. People wouldn't even talk to him because you're not, again, in that elite exclusive group. So if that's the culture of the Western Greek church, that local church, then you will never have a rabbi relationship where you're, as the saying goes, covered in the dust of his or her feet. And that saying means that you're following so closely with your rabbi, with the teachings, in relationship when you need counsel, that you're literally covered with the same dust that they walk in. And that could be obviously metaphorical because that happens, we know, by video chat, right? But that will never happen if there's no relationship. So there's this exclusivity, and it makes people feel like they can't connect, like they can't be a part. And by the way, if you track with one of these and you're wrestling through it, maybe in your own church, or maybe this was one of the reasons why you left a church, give me the thumbs up and then let me see your experience with it. The second thing that we see, and this is actually one of my big things that make my head explode. Hey, Rai, good to see you in Taiwan. Misinterpretation and misapplication of scriptures, both historically and through to present day. There is an absolute distortion and loss of meaning in the Western Greek church's teaching as it connects to scriptures. I've been teaching for over 25 years, and again, I'm talking about the norm. I've been teaching for over 25 years about the distinct differences of the Hebraic worldview and the Greek worldview. And that was a process for me to learn it, to come into it, to have the courage to talk about it to the people I was teaching. It's a process. But one of the things that we always say together is context, context, context. And the Western Greek church, in its interpretation and application of scriptures, do not care about context. I know I'm making general statements, but they can't. There's often linguistic problems, there's cultural ignorance of the context, and the big one, which we mostly know about, the replacement theology that the Greek Western Church lives by. Meaning, how they view this is that the Western Church, specifically the American Western Church, has replaced Judaism, has replaced the practice of Judaism. And that's called the replacement theology. And that is sort of just like when we remember Thanksgiving and we celebrate the bounty of God and all that we have to be thankful for, and we forget that this country was stolen from its original inhabitants, and we're now replacing the original inhabitants, and somehow that's okay because the replacement is the better one. That's the same exact thing as the Western Church saying that they've replaced Judaism. Once that happens, then stewardship becomes replaced with power and greed. And the teaching is that the Western Church has replaced Judaism and all the festivals and all the practices, and it has not. You may have heard this, pastors teach this all the time about Pentecost, that the church started at Pentecost. It did not. That was the Hebrew festival of Shavuot. When we read the Bible, we do not swap out Israel for the U.S. or the temple for the Western church. Everything comes through the conduit of Israel, of the temple, of the Jewish people, of Judaism, and it continues with the story of us today. We don't apply the laws of Israel or the laws specifically given to the Jewish people living within Israel, or even the Jewish people outside of Israel. We don't apply them and change them to match our church paradigm because they're written to specific people. Hello, you don't swap out a church from the temple. Priests are not pastors. Nothing is replaced. It's all part of the story of redemption. When Paul writes to the local gatherings, he is writing specifically to them in the apostles, in their cities, with their distinct problems. He's not replacing Judaism, as he says so himself, and he's not giving directives to churches in 2019. He can maybe talk about principles, but these are not literal, let's transfer. These were dealing with churches with specific problems in that specific city. This misinterpretation and misapplication of things takes things way out of cultural context and causes most of the problems we see today with organized religion. It is extremely difficult for people to listen to someone who's supposed to be a professional teacher. They're not studying and they give some kind of crazy interpretation of scripture and an insane application of it, and sometimes it supports an agenda, right? And other times it just leaves people saying, wait, what did he just say? See, the Western church's model is owned and operated with a Greek viewpoint. So it's defined by events, its tangible results, and its physicality. So tragically, pastors, and I feel sorry for pastors who really aren't satisfied with this model. I was one of them for many years. Pastors' time allotment for study and their willingness and ability to open up a new idea is very controlled by what brings in the money. As we know, the Greek worldview is noun focused. So since it's a Greek worldview church, what are the nouns? The nouns are buildings. The nouns are instruments. The nouns are tech equipment. The nouns are the number of people. The nouns are the number of dollars in the basket. The number of people that walk to the altar. The number of new church plants. This is what the Greek Western church looks at as success. The Hebraic perspective is verbs, journey, process, relationships. So the two are going to be at odds. So if you are a Hebraic thinker, hey Chris, great to see you. If you are a Hebraic thinker, you are going to struggle with this and try to find ways to bring that Hebraic way of thinking into your community. Number 3, are you with me? Are you still with me? Number 3, the Western church model does not align with one's values. And by the way, if you found a church that you don't have any of these problems with, you need to be on your knees thanking God for this place, right? Because what I'm talking about, again, is I'm not saying every church in the U.S. is bad. By no means am I saying that. What I'm saying is for the people who are struggling with these things, we want to talk about that. So number 3, the Western church model does not align with one's values, like relationships and time and what money is invested in and what's happening outside of the doors of the church. And what happens is in this model, and again, I know the pressure of this all too well, the building's rent or expenses, the salaries, the electric, the production expenses, the insurance, the equipment, fuel this Western model. So all effort needs to go into being able to have these things. And no matter how much you say, oh no, I don't care about things I care about people, this is a real tension in this model because these things just overcome you. I mean, when I was a pastor in a physical building, I have to say I probably, depending on which building it was, I put probably 10 hours or sometimes more just into the maintenance and cleaning of the building every week. That's a lot of hours. Okay. And that's not even counting the hours I spent worrying about the building. Pastors are scrambling to do damage control and somehow manufacture passion from the shrinking faithful. And Sunday productions are wearing thin. I've talked to a lot of pastors who feel like, how creative and different can I possibly be? The vision becomes stuck then inside the building. And it takes money and it takes time to keep the machine running. Tithes and its definition has become twisted to make people believe that giving 10% has to go to the local organization. So they take the laws of the tabernacle and the temple and tithing and project them right into their organization, all the while saying the law was replaced by grace. So there's a little bit of a contradiction there. Serving becomes about faithfulness to the organization. Susan B. Anthony once said, I distrust those people who know so well what God wants them to do because I notice it always coincides with their own desires. What is important to people is not often important to the Western church model that we see in the U.S. It's just different values. Number 4, you're sticking with me. The church is neither taking a stand against injustice or working to make a difference in the world. And this is quite possibly the thing that I hear the most from people. Their frustration was there is a complete disconnect from evil and its devastation in the world. And the silence is deafening. Okay, the lack of response from pastors is deafening. And the only ones that seem to be, I shouldn't say the only ones, but the ones with the loudest voices are the ones with the wrong messages, okay? It hurts. Now, let me say this. Change is hard. People want to go to their church. They want to close those doors sometimes, and they want to feel safe. If Chris is still watching, Chris and Redondo will remember in 9/11, Chris and Redondo were our worship, and I would say they were pastors too, worship leaders and pastors. And they worked with us in a church on 33rd Street. And 9/11 happened, and little by little, we just started off slowly helping in whatever ways we could, and then more and more and more. And finally, what we ended up doing was taking that church building that we had at 33rd and kind of turning it into a respite center for all the people that were volunteering at the zone. And oh, good, Chris. All the people that were volunteering at the zone. So we had all these people sleeping all over the church. Then we had all these materials and equipment everywhere. And at the same time, our people, our New Yorkers, I don't even know how many people we would have sleeping in the church. 100? I don't know. There was just people everywhere. It literally turned into a respite center, a center where people could load up with equipment or debrief or whatever and then go back down to the zone. At the same time, our church people were hurting. Their city just got attacked. People felt this level of they just completely came apart and weren't safe. I myself took my children and barricaded myself in the house for like 4 or 5 days and didn't come out. We watched fun things, we played fun games, and we learned how to re-enter into this new world. So I get it. And the last thing they wanted to do was come on Sunday and see their church look like some kind of warehouse. But hey, what were we there for? What were we there for? And so we got together with the leadership and we said, we have to do this. We don't even know how messy it's going to be, but we have to turn our church into a center to make sure that people are helped in whatever way that looks like. And it was messy. But in some of the, and people left. People left the church and said, no, I don't want to be reminded of this. I want to go into a place where I feel safe and I can forget. But the people that stayed understood something. And Matthew 15:8 and 9 said, these people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far away from me. The worship of me is useless because they teach man-made rules as if they were doctrines. Interesting. In Judaism, the sages, the rabbis, made a stand, all of them did, about what they believed were good practices according to Torah in the world. So, in other words, they studied Torah and then they were able to understand with all this study how to interpret and apply for everyday life. Andre's song Playing Hooky is really, really a good song. And I would have played that song if you can find that and listen to it. Listen to it. It's a phenomenal song. I would have played it. He played it when he taught 2 weeks ago, and I would have played it in the opening, but I was afraid Facebook would have flagged the teaching because sometimes they're looking out for copyright infringement. But it is an awesome song, really, really good. So when rabbis would make rulings about things, and rabbis disagreed with each other sometimes and often actually times, but they made rulings, and those rulings about how to interpret certain scriptures and how to apply that and to your life was called their yoke. It was their belief system. It was how they practiced interpretation and application of scriptures. So here's the thing. You knew exactly where your rabbi stood with the practical application of Torah. Even if you disagreed with something that he said, or even if he disagreed with 10 other rabbis in your city, it didn't matter. You knew exactly where he or she stood, right? With how they interpreted and applied. Everything from dietary to marriage to money. And some of these things were extremely political. Yeshua's own words were chocked full of political sarcasm and direct verbal attacks at political leaders that were oppressing. Instead, what the work outside of our modern day Western churches has become, and again, not all of them, you understand, I'm never one that says everything all the time, right? But many, and this is what people are struggling with who are part of a church, has rather than become about a focus of what's going on and speaking against what's going on and making a stand and being active about what's going on that is counter to what we should see, counter to anything that we should believe is okay as followers of Yeshua, we say something like, let's raise a lot of money, let's send people to another country, and let's do something that looks a little like colonization, which is actually connected to branding. Because now we can say, look what we did here. We planted a church here. They play the same instruments, they sing the same songs, they wear their suits and ties. We did that. So we have a focus for the world. And I know I'm sounding a little sarcastic, but humor these days is my tool, right? Because, like the author said previously, I'm kind of done, okay? But that's what we're into now. And it's not making a difference. And it's leaving people feel like we don't care. And the last one, number 5. The Western Church, let me make sure that this is the right one. The Western Church no longer, nope, wrong one. Here we go. Number 5, sorry, I can no longer support the institution. That wasn't the right one. What you give your money to, give your time to, give your prayers to is part of you, and you are part of it. So, not that you're always going to be in complete agreement, of course, But when major values to you are not the values of your religious institution, by the way, I am absolutely not talking about petty, stupid things like, I don't like the way we vacuum, or I don't like this song, or I don't like this color. Like, I am not talking about that. I'm talking about major core value issues. So, again, not that we'll always be in complete agreement, but when values to you are not the values of your religious institution, there's a cognitive dissonance, there's a fracturing, there's a disconnect. It's not health, it's not wholeness. A board may argue about what color carpet to put down in the sanctuary, but if they're arguing about spending $50,000 for that carpet instead of having an after school tutoring center when the neighborhood is filled with latchkey kids whose parents are trying to pay the rent, there's a value problem there, right? When you invest in that model, you're propping it up. Your time, your prayers, your support, you're propping it up. And there will always be a time when one says, should I continue to support this because my support is actually helping it to stand? And boy, that's a tough thing to walk away from something when you know that it may not stand. In The Courage to Create, Rollo May writes, we are called upon to do something new, to confront a no man's land, to push into a forest where there are no well-worn paths from which no one has returned to guide us. This is what existentialists call the anxiety of nothingness. To live into the future means to leap into the unknown, and this requires a degree of courage for which there is no immediate precedent and which few people realize. Those are powerful words, right? So is it okay to leave this organized institution? And as Andre talked about in Hebrews, forsake not the assembling of yourselves together, is not talking about church attendance. And many of the other scriptures people may use are often actually referencing mandatory festival gatherings for the Jewish people at the temple. Okay. So to leave a man-made religious institution is fine. How you do that well is what we're going to be getting into in the next couple weeks, right? Because for some of us, we may be losing church, but we're finding God. We're not giving up on God. We're not losing God. We're not leaving God. But to do this, to walk through this process, it is very personal. It is very individual. And you have to trust your own heart. Proverbs 20:27, really good verse. The human spirit is a lamp of Adonai. It searches one's innermost being. The human spirit is a lamp of Adonai. And here's the thing we really have to trust in this process. Our heart will guide us, and it guides us, as we know this, by peace. It guides us by peace. And there's times when you have great energy for the battle, and you want to speak your truth, and you want to speak truth to power, and you want to confront, and you want to provoke, and you want to stir up things, you want to work for good, and all that, and you have the energy for that, and that's awesome. Do it, do it, do it, do it. But then there's other times when people don't have the energy. When they're, as we said, as the writer coined the term, done. They're the dones. And you'll know this because you'll see things that you can no longer be yoked with. You won't have the energy to rage against the machine any longer with the hope of change. Some people do, again, and they will stay and they will fight the good fight. But when you see that the core is poisoned, you see, even the best, most beautiful church communities with the most precious, beautiful people can become toxic when the source or the root is poison. I read an article several years ago, really interesting article. Phoebe, great to see you. Shabbat Shalom. about an Amazonian tribe that had generations that survived and thrived and lived their communities on the river. Their communal life was in and on the banks of the Amazon River. It's all they knew. Everything was done at the river. And then pollution and dams, these two problems, poisoned and thinned out their water supply. And it became toxic. The fish were dying. They were no longer there. What was there was sick. The kids were getting sick from swimming in the water. For a while, this small community tried to make a go of it. But the source was poisoned and depleted, and the source would not change. They could continue to live a sick life out of the river or leave their beloved river homes. So here's what happened in this community. It's really interesting. Some chose to leave, and they moved to other villages. And those villages had their own struggle because they were just on a different place of the river, right? Some moved to bigger cities, and they had their struggle in those bigger cities too, because those cities didn't have the same values as them. And so they kind of lost themselves. And so a lot of the people that moved to the bigger cities struggle with drug addictions and alcoholism and even obesity and all kinds of problems because it was not really their value system. Some, this is interesting, moved to the very monocrops to work with that were part of the problem. So some of the people that actually started this problem, that did these monocrops, one crop and just plowed down everything, they needed money, so they said, well, we're going to go work for them, and they became part of the problem. But others, a smaller group, moved a bit more up and into the jungle, away from the water that they've known their whole lives and their parents knew and their parents' parents knew. And they found water in an underground spring, and then they made a small stream from that, and they learned how to navigate their way. They changed their way of life. They still got fish. They still hunted. They farmed differently. They did permaculture farming, and they built a new community. It was a different community. They missed and longed for their original one, but that one could never exist again. When the source is toxic, you can stay. You can pretend that nothing is wrong and ingest the poison. You can join another tribe where the problems are the same but different. You can also become part of the problem, or you can move and create a new way. Now, I want you to read this and really think about it because it's a crazy thought. The church that I grew in, that I worked for, that I supported, that I loved, that I had vision for, was taken away by the grace of God. Whoo! Read that one more time. That is huge. I only said part of that statement for a little bit, and then I started to add by the grace of God. Can we trust him to, and I believe it. Can we trust him to be able to say this? Who doesn't trust that God can and will build his kingdom? Now listen, here's what we have to know. We're not skipping away. This is tough. There's a profound sense of grief and loss, and there's doubt. But as Barbara Brown Taylor writes in her book Leaving Church, which is really a wonderful book, by the way, if you haven't read it, definitely read it. It's about her journey from clergy, and she actually stepped away from her church and is no longer a pastor. She says, although I never found a church where I felt completely at home again, I made a new home in the world. I renewed my membership in the priesthood of all believers, who may not have as much power as we would like, but whose consolation prize is the freedom to meet God after work, well away from all centers of religious command, wherever God shows up. I love that. And again, if you can, definitely get that book. So we're going to close this very precious time together with the lighting of the Shabbos candles. And traditionally, the mother of the home usually is the one who lights the candles, which represent the light of peace and joy and unity. And then she encircles the candles with her hands 3 times as a gesture that welcomes in the Sabbath. Blessed are you, Yahweh our God, King of the universe, who has set us apart by his commandments, who has given us Yeshua the Messiah, and has sent us to be a light to the world. Amen. Shabbat Shalom.